This is a brief PowerPoint presentation about smallpox, which I did not include in my presentation about COVID and vaccines because it would have made it too long. But I think it's of interest and it really illustrates some of the concepts that we have talked about. So smallpox is an infectious disease caused by variola. It's very contagious, and the risk of death after contracting the disease is about 30%. Symptoms are fever, vomiting, skin rash. Then you see a characteristic bumps filled with fluid with a dent at the center. These bumps and scab over and fell off, leaving scars. The disease was spread between people or via contaminated objects. The earliest evidence of the disease dates to the 3rd century BCE, found in Egyptian mummies. Pharaoh Ramses V was known to be one of the first people with smallpox. It's a disease that killed populations over centuries, up to 300 million people in the 20th century and around 500 million people in the last 100 years of its existence. As well as 6 monarchs. As recently as 1967, 15 million cases occurred a year, and 1/3 of all cases of blindness were due to smallpox. Inoculation or variolation for smallpox appears to have started in China around the 1500s. And this was done by taking the scabs of smallpox that were blown into the nose of an individual who then contracted a mild form of the disease. But it also used the pus from the skin sores of the smallpox patients. It did reduce the mortality from 30% to 3%, but it was never risk-free because the patient could still die from the procedure, and it could still spread to others, causing an epidemic. Variolation claimed many victims, including some royalty. The son of King George III lost a son to the procedure, as did many others. It started in China, variolation. Europe adopted this practice from Asia in the first half of the 18th century, thanks to the efforts of Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who learned about it when she was living in Constantinople. She then persuaded the Princess of Wales and the Montagu, the ambassador, to use several prisoners and abandoned children for an experiment by having smallpox inserted under the skin. These then were deliberately exposed to smallpox later. When none contracted the disease, the procedure was deemed safe, and it became fashionable in Europe. So in colonial America, the variolation method was also introduced. It was brought by slaves because it was popular already in Africa. The practice was widespread, and slave communities that continued the practice of inoculation, whatever part of Africa they may have come from. Cotton Mather learned about the practice from Onesimus, his slave, and he followed Onesimus's advice. He publicized the technique, and he first tried it during a smallpox epidemic in 1721, although others strongly opposed the idea. So we need now to look at the correlation with cowpox, recognizing that cowpox was known to protect against smallpox. Farmers, milkmaids, and other people who regularly worked with cattle and horses were spared during smallpox outbreaks. The British Army investigated this in 1790 and showed that horse-mounted troops were less infected by smallpox than infantry, probably because they had been exposed to a similar virus called horsepox virus. At least 6 people tested the possibility of using cowpox vaccine for an immunization for smallpox in humans. The English farmer Benjamin Jesty, the German teacher Peter Plett. Jesty inoculated his wife and 2 young sons with cowpox, making them immune not only to further cases of cowpox, but also to smallpox. The honor of the discovery is attributed to him, but he was no scientist and did not repeat or publish his findings, but he is considered to be the first to use cowpox as a vaccination. Peter Plett in 1790 learned from milkmaids about cowpox preventing them from being infected with smallpox. He inoculated 3 children with cowpox lymph, which protected them against smallpox. 5 years later, Edward Jenner discovered this very method, which made him world famous. And what did Jenner do? He did exactly the same thing. He took some pus from a milkmaid named Sarah Nelms and injected James Phipps with it. And then 3 days later, the inoculation developed redness and then a pustule. 6 weeks later, Jenner variolated Phipps, that is, he injected him with the actual smallpox, and found that he had been protected because of the cowpox vaccination. Jenner prepared a paper describing his success, but the Royal Society declined it. That it said the ideas were too revolutionary. Jenner continued his observations and experiments, and then finally published it and called the process vaccination, named after vaccinae, from the word for cow, which is vacca in Latin. And so the procedure became known as vaccination. And here's a distinction between variolation, which shows a pretty significant blistering and pustule, and vaccination. So variolation causes a more severe skin eruption, but much less severe than the full-blown smallpox. Vaccination generally causes a single pustule at the site of inoculation. Francisco Javier de Balmes became the physician of King Charles IV. In 1803, he persuaded the king to send an expedition to America to propagate this vaccine that had been recently discovered. He sailed from Spain in 1804 and visited Puerto Rico, Havana, Merida, Veracruz, Mexico City, got as far north as Texas, and as far south as New Granada. And what he did was to take 22 young boys who had never had cowpox or smallpox before, 3 to 9 years old, from the orphanages of Spain. And during the trip across the Atlantic, he vaccinated the orphans sequentially, 2 at a time. When the cowpox pustules had appeared on their arm, he used material from those 2 active boys' lesions and used it to vaccinate 2 more, and continue that until he had a number of boys with lesions that could be used to infect others with cowpox. And the expedition saved millions of lives. But as we know, the introduction of smallpox into other populations of the New World decimated them, was a major cause of the extinction of the indigenous tribes that were found in the New World. There was great resistance to the cowpox inoculation because people felt they would develop cow-like features, udders, horns, cows, and legs. So resistance to immunization, unfortunately, continues to this very day. What did we learn from smallpox? Well, after inoculation, vaccination using the cowpox virus became the primary defense against smallpox. After an infection by the cowpox virus, the body gains the ability to recognize a similar smallpox virus by its antigens and is able to fight the smallpox disease much more efficiently. This understanding became the basis of future research in immunology, paved the way for the development of vaccines, including those for COVID-19. The last known naturally occurring case of smallpox was diagnosed in 1977 in Somalia, and the World Health Organization declared smallpox eradicated in 1980. It was eradicated solely through vaccination.